Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Games Mania. Now you may see that we're in a totally different place than we usually do this. We're actually in my home at the moment. I'm unable to get into the studio, so we're recording it from here. And the reason behind that is that I'm going to be going away for a little while. I need to do some work abroad, so I will be unable to host any more episodes of this show. So I think this will probably be the very last Games Mania. I know it's been short-lived, but I've really enjoyed doing this. So thank you all for taking the time to watch these, and I hope you get something out of it. But I'm not going to get bogged down with all this last show stuff. I'm going to just plough straight on, and we're going to do what we did last time, and we're going to talk news. So some of the big news this last week in the gaming world has been the Playdate console. Now what is this, you may wonder? Well, I have some information here which I'm going to be sharing with you. Playdate is a new handheld gaming console. So it's pretty different, pretty unique. It's quite exciting. It's being brought to you by Panic. Now they're a company who has made software for the Mac and iOS, and they've decided to jump into games some time ago now, and they published the game Firewatch and something coming soon called Entitled Goose Game. And they've decided what they want to do is create a console. Now Playdate will be delivering games in a subscription-like service to this portable console. There'll be 12 brand new games, one each week, for the first year of the console's lifespan. The console itself is a small yellow squarish thing. I mean, we'll show a picture of it. With a black and white screen. It's interesting how they've done this. They seem to be going to create very simple games with this console, but so far it doesn't sound very appealing. You know, you've got something akin to a Game Boy with a black and white screen, two face buttons, an A and a B, and a D-pad, an external speaker as well, of course, and what looks like a power button. But there's something else on this console which makes it stand out. It's got a crank. Yes, it has a crank. Very weird. So some of the games, or all of the games, I'm not sure at the moment, will be controlled using a hand crank mechanism, which is on the right hand side of the console. So it's it's fantastic. They call it a rotating analog controller that will put a new spin on games. The Crankin's Time Travel Adventure is one of the games they've announced already, and if you go on to the Playdate website you can find some footage of that particular game. Apparently it's extremely fun, and the Playdate's going to cost $149 on its release, and it will ship early 2020, so it's a little way off yet, but it seems like it'll design a piece of kit that will fit in the palm of your hand, and you'll be able to play these 12 games included in the price of the unit. So yeah, I think this could be very interesting, and it's worth keeping an eye on the Playdate for sure. Now going from one console which hopefully will do very well to a console which once was the darling of Kickstarter, and that is the Ouya. For those not familiar, the Ouya was a little cube console you plugged into your television, and you could download games for it. A game called Towerfall became extremely popular on the Ouya, which was a multiplayer arena-based platform deathmatch type game. It's a little difficult to describe. But the Ouya, apart from having quite a few games available for it, was quite small. And I think at the time a lot of people saw it as something, you know, they could easily sit in their living room by their TV. It's fairly unobtrusive, not like a larger console. But yeah, the Ouya is now no more. And, the Ouya will not receive any more support, and I've got some dates here. It's It's going to be shut down on the 25th of June. So yeah, that was Ouya. Ouya's been around for quite a fair few years now. It's been about 6-7 years, from what I remember. It could even be longer. It probably is longer actually. And the idea of it was pretty cool, I thought at the time. And the controller wasn't so bad, and you could actually get some reasonably high profile games on it. It sort of felt like a lot of the games you might be able to play on an Android phone, for example. So are we sad to see the Ouya go? I don't think many people are going to miss the Ouya, but if you're curious what it looked like, we'll probably have a picture on screen so you can see. The unit was very small, the controller was bigger than the actual console was. But yeah, where there were competent games on it, there wasn't much that you couldn't play elsewhere. Now, for a while, Towerfall was exclusive, but now Towerfall is a game that which I think is on every major console and PC platform. So maybe the Ouya's done its bit and it's time to move on. But it's interesting to see a console which received so much support on Kickstarter just a few years back, now unfortunately going the way of the dodo, as they say. So here's some big news about E3 that's coming up, and this year, I think it's June, July, is it? I forget when E3 is. It's a summer games convention. But there was a game that was present there last year, and that was Cyberpunk 2077. Now, what is Cyberpunk 2077, you may ask? Well, it's a open world role-playing game from the developers of The Witcher. Now, you might have heard of The Witcher. The Witcher 3 particularly, it was an incredibly successful game for the game's developer CD Projekt Red. And what Cyberpunk 2077 hopes to do is recreate a Witcher-like experience, but this time in a future setting. So they have Cyberpunk. Yes, it's even the title of the game, and I could not even remember what it was. But yeah, to recreate that sort of experience, but in a cyberpunk setting. So there's robots, technology. It's going to be a bit like Blade Runner, a bit like Akira, a bit like Ghost in the Shell. All those sort of very influential movies and books and such are going to be influencing this particular game. Now, this year at E3, the game will be present, but it will not be playable still, which I think has come as a big surprise to a lot of people. Because I think it's been a year since it was last seen. There was definitely the game was running a year ago, but you weren't allowed to play it. Now, this year there's going to be more of these hands-off demos of the game, whether or not they'll now be available to the general public, because as last year they're only available to press, or they'll perhaps be showing a different part of the game, but it could very well just be the same demo they showed last year. But you won't be able to play it. But I do mention Cyberpunk 2077 because it looks to be like one of the most maybe groundbreaking games that are on the horizon, at least that we'll see at E3. There's bound to be a few more surprises, but Cyberpunk was one I think many people were very excited about seeing, in the fact that we're not going to get it. Yeah, it's definitely newsworthy. So PlayStation Productions, what's that, you may ask? Well, this is a new film studio from Sony. Sony have their own film studio now to develop products based on their franchises. So rather than farm off the God of War movie to another studio, Sony want to handle it internally by making their own studio, so they can remain true to the game, basically. We talked about Detective Pikachu last episode, and that's done incredibly well, and that is one of the few examples of a franchise turned into a movie which is true to its source material. It doesn't try and squeeze one of the 20+ hour adventures of a Pokemon game into a movie. What it does is it takes one of the other games in the series, which is a slightly more condensed storyline, and turns that into the movie instead. So obviously there, Warner Brothers and Pokemon Company and Nintendo had an understanding of what they were trying to produce, and it went well, but in the past it hasn't happened. I think what Sony want to do is try and avoid some of those past errors of movies and creating specific movies that are tailored more to the core of the game's feel, if that makes any sense. So it will have the spirit of the game, at least, if not being an exact copy of the storyline. Because how can you tell, like, what may be like a 20-40 hour game storyline within a 2 hour film? You've got to make some changes somewhere, and I think it's a mistake to try and squeeze it all in. So this will enable Sony to make movies which feel truer to the franchises and to their franchises, and hopefully will produce some good movies in the end. So I think it's going to be very exciting to see what PlayStation Productions brings us in the future and whether or not they manage to live up to their promise. So we're going to jump now into our topic for this week, which we're going to talk a little bit about collecting. So video games collecting, it's huge. If you're a retro gamer especially and you frequent YouTube, you'll probably be familiar with the games rooms and game room tours. People are very proud of their video game collections, and it has become a very collectible hobby. And if you watch those in the US, you'll see that most people are there collecting NES games. You may even watch shows like The Game Chasers, where they go out there and they try and find these games in the wild. They try and find bargains, because a lot of these games are very expensive. So there's this idea now online of the bigger the games collection, the better, basically. And you've got all these people out there boasting about how many games they've got, what their games room looks like. And I think perhaps to some people it can be a little bit daunting getting into the idea of games collecting. First, on the off, I'm just going to say, collect the games that you want to play. In my personal opinion, I'm a bit of a collector myself, but my ethos for collecting has always been, collect what you want to collect. And I do find the notion of just collecting every game for a system to be kind of crazy. Because you wouldn't want to buy every movie created by a movie studio, for example. Because to buy every movie ever created would just be ridiculous. Yeah, to narrow it down, would you want to buy every movie Universal Pictures have ever released? No, you wouldn't. And you wouldn't want to buy every game that was ever released for Nintendo Entertainment System. But, fair play to everybody who does want to do that. That is their prerogative. But for me, that's never been what collecting is all about. What I think is interesting about a personal collection of games, never how big or how small it is it reflects the person. It's personal to the collector's interests. And I find it quite interesting to see collectors who might not have the biggest collection, but to see what games from that particular console they selected to collect, to own. And I think that's the most fascinating thing about collections. And if you're going to make videos on video game collections, I think that is, again, the most interesting thing you could do with that. Now, how do you collect is another question. Well, do you choose to just collect for one console, maybe one console you feel particularly fond of? Or do you have an interest in several different consoles? Personally, I've owned a lot of consoles over my time, and I've been able to get certain consoles for very cheap. My first video game console was the Sega Master System. I have a rather small collection of games for that console because I moved on from that onto the N64, and again had a rather small collection of games for that to begin with. The notion of collecting video games probably didn't come to me until possibly the PS2, PS1, and that is because basically I got the PS1 rather late in its life. I don't even know if it was available new by the time I bought it, but I started to get games for that I knew were good. So there was a list of games that I'd missed out on, so I started to, I guess, collect games to get a better idea of that system. And at that time I was working in games retail, so I had access to a lot of games at very reasonable prices. So that for me is how the collecting bug sort of started, and that spilled out into PlayStation 2 as well, because these games at the time, at least, and still are in most respects, very inexpensive. And then I got into import gaming when I started university. I wanted to play some of the fighting games that were released in Japan for the Sega Saturn. So what I did was I picked up a Japanese Sega Saturn and would purchase import games on eBay that were to my tastes, and they were mostly fighting games because that's a genre that I wanted to play the most. So then that developed into a sort of collection. I did a similar thing with the Xbox 360 as I did with the PlayStation. I got it late on in life. I had a Wii for the longest time. The Wii was my most... that sounds terrible. I had a Wii for the longest time. Anyway, what I was going to say is... Yeah, the only console I had was Nintendo Wii for a while. The only modern console, at least. I had the retro ones. But so I was mostly just getting every game for that and ignoring what was on the Xbox 360. Again, down the line, I got a 360. I got a PS3 when these consoles were affordable. And then started to amass a collection. How my brain worked this time was I wanted to have a good collection for each system. So I wanted to have varied game types in that collection. Even though my favourite types of games, it took a long time for me to realise what my favourite types of games were. But I realised my favourite types of games are fighting and shooting and driving and platform games for the most part. The big adventure games aren't ones I sit down and play mostly, but some of these games are so interesting that you just want to try them anyway. But when I was buying these games to add to my console collections, I was also thinking about, well, what if I had some people come over and we only had the PlayStation 3 hooked up and we want to play a football game? Well, do I have a football game for PlayStation 3? So I'd get a football game, very cheap. And then I'd do the same for perhaps... another console like the Xbox. Oh, I need a football game for Xbox just in case, you know. So what I wanted to do was create a rather full and varied collection for each system, and that's really what I've gone on to do. So as well as the games I really am interested in, I've also bought other games that I'm thinking, you know, it will be good to have that type of game on that system. I've got, for example, a Tony Hawk's game on every system because that got into a collecting thing eventually. And sometimes things progress into, oh yeah, I could do with a skateboarding game for that console. Or I don't have a skateboarding game, let's get one. And I was like, yeah, but I haven't got it for this console. And then sometimes this can spiral out of control. And that's when collecting could become a little bit of an issue. Thankfully, I don't think I've ever let it totally overcome me. I've always been very vigilant with my money, and I've always been very aware how much I was spending on video games, and always trying to get the cheapest deals and so on and so forth. And I've never spent more than £60 on any one video game. I bought Conker's Bad Fur Day second hand for £60, which was a lot of money for me. I know there's those who will be willing to spend more, but I have to say to myself, does not go beyond that. Maybe one day I will, but I didn't manage to go overboard with Knuckles Chaotix either for the Sega 32X, which is often a very expensive game. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say on collecting. It's a topic which we could definitely continue to talk about, and it'd be interesting to hear other people's opinions on that. So if you do have an opinion on video game collecting, then I'd be interested to hear it. I'm going to move on to our game of the week this week, which is Team Sonic Racing. Now this is a Sonic the Hedgehog racing game, not so dissimilar to Mario Kart, which is available now on all systems. That's the Xbox One, PS4, Nintendo Switch. I'm not sure about PC. Usually with Sonic games you'll get a PC version later on down the line, if not already. So why is this game worth playing? Because it's already my game of the week. Well, if you enjoyed any of the previous Sonic racing games, what was it called? Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing Transformed were the last one. So as well as featuring Sonic characters, also featured characters from other Sega franchises. And then going back further, original Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing was again a very fun game. What made these games really stand out was the great track design, the emphasis on power sliding, and the fact that they just felt tight and enjoyable. Sometimes Mario Kart clones, as they've become known as, don't always succeed in what they're trying to achieve, because Mario Kart set the bar very high. Now, the first game I think that managed to really hit the nail on the head there and get something that was as enjoyable as Mario Kart was probably Crash Team Racing. Now, Diddy Kong Racing is also a good example. And I go as far to say that Team Sonic Racing is another one of the best examples of a kart type racer that you can imagine. And as I say, it does this through just having really tight handling, tight gameplay, great track design. In this new game, they've added something new into the mix. Now, what they've done is you race as part of a team. So each team is made up of 3 racers. And so you help each other out to win the race, and you have to try and aid your other racers by maybe giving them items. When you pick up an item now, you can either use it on yourself or offer it to one of your teammates. Or you can also drive in their slipstream and slingshot off their slipstream. So if you drive behind them, you can see that their path of where they've gone, and you can, if you stay in that for as long as possible, you can get a boost out of that. So you work together to complete the races, and at the end of the race or the end of the Grand Prix, you'll see all your combined points. So as well as being the number 1 racer, it does help to also make sure the other members of your team also finish in a high place. So this game adds something new to the mix, but still retains all the things that made the last Team Sonic Racing games great. It also includes vehicle customization. So as you gain points in the game, you'll get coins, and those coins you can spend on random upgrades. So you can buy basically like a capsule toy machine. You put your money in, you get a random item. Then you can use these to upgrade the vehicles in a similar way you could in the last games. You can also customize vehicles and change the colours of them and such, which is a nice feature. I've been playing the game on the Nintendo Switch, which plays very well. It's not running at 60 frames per second like the other versions are. It's running at 30 frames per second. Now, apparently this is something that you must be aware of when buying games. It's never been something I've ever paid particular attention to. You can notice when something's running faster, 60 frames per second, yes. The refresh rate of the graphics is faster or something like that. I don't think for the average person, if you're playing Team Sonic Racing on your Switch, it's going to bother you that much. It doesn't bother me personally. The game is certainly fast enough, but you may notice it to be a little bit slower than maybe some of the other karting games you've played, maybe, if they're running in 60 frames per second. I don't know. Not something you should even think about, in my opinion. The graphics look great, definitely comparable with the graphics on Xbox One and PS4. So I think you get the same enjoyment out of playing on the Switch. So that's the first thing. Also, Switch is portable, which is fantastic. So I can play the game on the go. So I can really recommend the Switch version if you're thinking about getting it for that console. The other versions, as I've said, they're both 60 frames per second. Maybe the graphics are slightly better, but there's no difference in load times at least. So Team Sonic Racing is available now, and I really recommend trying it out. Other games that I can recommend this week are Baku Baku Animal, which was a Sega Saturn game. So this is a retro game available for Sega's 32-bit Saturn console. I've been playing the Japanese version of it because it's cheaper. You find a lot of the PAL region games, the games that are released in Europe, tend to be more expensive than the Japanese counterparts. And if there's not an emphasis on reading, if it's not an RPG or an adventure type game, they're usually very accessible. Baku Baku Animal is a puzzle game, not too dissimilar from Tetris or Columns or Puyo Puyo or any one of those particular games, where blocks fall from the top of the screen. You get 2 blocks always connect to each other, and the blocks contain different images: carrot, bone, banana, or basically foodstuffs. And then they can also contain animals' faces, like a dog, a rabbit, a monkey, for example. So what the idea is in this game is you've got to line up the animal with the foodstuff. So you basically drop the piece into the playing area and try and line up so many of the same foodstuff, so then line up the animal with it, and so the animal will eat that, and you can create combos and stuff, and you're always playing against another player, so the computer, if you're playing around, it'd be a computer player, and when you succeed and get so many points, it then drops extra blocks into the other players' areas, so the first one to sort of reach the top is the loser. So it's a really fun game. I mean, it's a very simple concept, but it works incredibly well. It'll be interesting to know if there's anything similar on mobile phones that take the same concept that you might want to check out. But for now, if you have a Sega Saturn, it's a game I can really recommend. The next recommendation will be Last Day of June, a game I played on the PS4, which is a story-driven puzzle game. And it's really worth your time. It's very emotional. Basically, to give away too much of the story will be to spoil the game, so I'm going to try and keep this relatively brief. But the story concerns a couple. One of the couple passes away, and it's about how the other partner deals with the loss, basically. So the surviving member of the couple finds out through a alternate reality he can influence those past events that resulted in his partner's death. It's very interesting stuff. So basically what happens is you play as other characters who, through what they were doing at the time of your partner's death, their behaviour could influence whether or not your partner lives or dies in the past, hopefully to change the future. So the game sees you playing first as a child whose actions were directly resulted in your partner dying. So you play as a child, and you learn what happened through playing out a scenario, and then you have the option to go back in and replay that in a different way to stop that event. And if you're successful in doing that, you move on to the next character in the game, which is the neighbour of the couple, and you'll find out how her backstory is related to the couple, and how maybe changing what she did can also change the events of the past. Very clever game, utterly charming, beautiful art style as well, and great music by Stephen Wilson. And Stephen Wilson, known as being a progressive rock musician, who delivers a very sort of like very nuanced, very sort of mellow vibe to the game's music. And it generally is quite a chilled out game to play. I mean, the events sound a bit sad, but the game's got so much charm, personality, that it's never overwhelming. It just feels quite beautiful and quite poignant. It's a great game. It's well worth checking out. I think it's relatively affordable, and as well as PS4, I think a Nintendo Switch version has also been released. I'm not sure if you play it on Xbox One or PC, but I do imagine so. So check that out. That's Last Day of June. And finally, as far as recommendations go, do check out Space Invaders Extreme 2, available on the original DS. Now this is a revamped version of the classic Space Invaders, which is like turned up to the max basically. You use both screens, and you have Space Invaders attacking you, and you can shoot beyond them onto the upper screen of the DS, where you can shoot some of the UFOs to gain extra points. But it's the over-top presentation that really sells this game, when you've got the announcer shouting, "Great job, you did well, level 2," and all this sort of thing that you associate with arcade games, and games like Ridge Racer, for example. "Great lap, you're way out in front," and all these kinds of things that you hear in those games. But to see Space Invaders delivered with so much flair and so much craziness, it's really an experience that you should definitely check out if you're a fan of those simple style arcade shooter games. You'll also find that Space Invaders Extreme 2, as did its prequel, which was also available on I think the DS and PSP, it delivers some fantastic old school shooting action with enough twists on the formula to keep it fresh, in a similar way that Pac-Man DX, I think, did as a revamped version of Pac-Man, which you could play on I think the PS3 and Xbox 360 and maybe some other consoles as well. So that'll be my recommendations for this this episode. And lastly, we're going to move on to new releases. Now, these ones I'm just going to mention now are things that have been released recently, which we didn't touch on the last episode. And that's Saints Row the Third got a release on the Nintendo Switch. And I think it's great the Switch has a Grand Theft Auto type game, because those who aren't familiar with the Saints Row series, it was like Grand Theft Auto, but just a little bit more crazier, a little bit more out there. And the fact that we've got one of these games, and a game that a lot of people really consider to be one of the high points of the series, which is the third installment. In fact, we've got this on the Switch now, really great. So if you want that type of game on a portable console as well, then maybe you'd be interested in picking that one up. Everybody's Golf VR has been released, and I was hoping this would be an add-on for the previously released Everybody's Golf game for PS4, but it's actually a standalone game. So if you want to experience golf in virtual reality, then now's your chance with that particular title. And Assassin's Creed 3 has been remastered and re-released for Nintendo Switch, so if you've played through that game previously and are a big fan of it and want to play through it again portably, you can do that. Or if you never played the game before and you're a Switch owner, now's the opportunity to jump in and try that game. Also, Resident Evil 4 has been re-released on Switch, so again, if you like that game, you might want to play it portably. Or if you haven't played Resident Evil 4 for any reason, then you should totally play that, because it's, like, in my opinion, the best in the series. The one I enjoyed the most, anyway. Another good one, though, is Resident Evil 7, which has received a PlayStation Hits version, meaning that it's available now at a discounted price. You can buy it online for just £10 nowadays. So if you haven't experienced Resident Evil 7, you're a fan of horror games, this does take it to the next level through using a first-person perspective. And if you buy this version, you can also play it in VR. So if you're an owner of PlayStation VR, then yeah, you can experience a truly terrifying game in virtual reality. So coming out on the 28th of May, we've got Cricket 19 for Xbox One, PlayStation 4 and Switch. So if you've been after a cricket game for a while, then now's your chance to pick one up. Little Friends Dogs and Cats is also released on Nintendo Switch on the 28th of May. So if you're a Nintendogs or Nintendogs fan, you can also, of course, as it mentioned in the title, look after cats in that game as well. So maybe worth checking out if you're a fan of Nintendogs. But I don't think this particular installment is developed by Nintendo. I could be wrong about that, but maybe worth just finding out a bit more about that one. Among the Sleep Enhanced is released on Nintendo Switch on the 29th of May. I think it may also be released on other platforms, but this will be the first time it's coming to Switch. It's a first-person survival horror type game with a fantasy vibe, where you play as a child who gets transported into a dream world. The Teddy starts talking to them, and they have to basically escape from this scary world where you have to hide yourself from these shadow monsters, which is big. As a child, what's really interesting about the game is you see it at a child's perspective as you crawl around. So these ethereal kind of ghost creatures are very tall and scary, and hiding from them it creates for a very intense experience. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, you can pick that up from the 29th of May. And Blood and Truth is released for PlayStation 4 VR also on the 29th of May. And what that is a heist type game set in London. You're part of a team. I think you commit a crime. Don't know, it's a bank robbery, and you have to get away. And so if you have to sort of a crime simulator, and you enjoyed that little mini game in PlayStation Worlds, which was a similar sort of getaway situation, then you may enjoy this one a lot. It looks to me, and I think it was originally planned as a getaway game. If you remember that series back on the PS2, The Getaway and The Getaway 2, which were based in London and were these gritty crime action games. And that's it. That brings us to the end of the show. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch. And also like to say thank you very much to Condor Online for having me, and thank you for this opportunity. I've really enjoyed it. I'm really appreciative to the time everyone's put into putting these shows together. a big shout out to Chase and Roy for taking a chance on me in the first place, and for all the time and effort that Chase has put into putting these shows together. So thanks again to everyone at Condor Online, and all's left for me to say is thanks again, and don't forget to game on.